This whole thing, though, gets very confused when we look at the emergence of the Mendelian model, because it's here we begin to see how complex the issues are. Think of what I said about genotype and phenotype, and the fact that this comes out of Mendelianism, that not all the characteristics that we see in an individual reflect the underlying genotype. So what that means is, in the Mendelian model, there can be hidden reservoirs of inheritable conditions that do not express themselves in a particular individual. You, in society, are not able to identify these individuals as being dangerous to the biological stock, because that particular characteristic has not expressed itself in such a way that you can identify it. And individuals like Goddard, who I'm very keen on, I'm not keen on his ideas, I'm keen on Goddard because he came up with the term moron. I like that. I don't think we use the word moron very much anymore. But in fact, moron was a technical term at this time, and a technical term that emerged out of the psychological stroke eugenic Mendelian programs from the pen of people like Goddard. That's the only thing he's really remembered for now. Or historically, the Kallikak family, where he was able to identify a family in the Appalachian who had all the characteristics of the kind of individuals that needed to be bred out. Generations of alcoholics and criminals that people like Goddard wanted to use specific programs to ensure that they did not breed. So Mendelianism, when it emerges, places far more demands on eugenics than Darwinism ever did. But after the First World War, it all comes together. We see this synthesis of Darwin and Mendel that is then taken forward into a newly invigorated eugenic program that has absolutely disastrous consequences in the period from 1930 to 1945. Haldane himself, one of probably the best science writers of the 20th century, as well as being a major scientist in his own right. But the person I want to focus on to see how this process pans out in terms of eugenics is Charles Davenport, the man who was put in charge of Cold Spring Harbor in 1910 with money from the Carnegie Foundation to set up this institution that was going to explore heredity. Charles Davenport, whose Heredity in Relation to Eugenics is one of the most important texts in the history of eugenics. You know, we've talked a bit about Andrew Marr's documentaries, and one of the things that I mentioned is that they're not without their flaws. In the section where he talks about social Darwinism in some detail, he explores Cold Spring Harbor and he explores Davenport, and he explores them as examples of the misuse of Darwinism. He explores them as examples of social Darwinism in action. Now, it couldn't be further from the truth, because at the time, Davenport did not have a Darwinian bone in his body. He was an out-and-out Mendelian, an individual who has rejected Darwin's dangerous idea in favour of the Mendelian model, which is at this time not integrated with Darwinian natural selection. Of course, at that time, they can't explore DNA. They can't explore physically the genotype. They can't do what we do today in identifying different loci to identify specific positions. They have to figure things out in terms of genetics using techniques like fruit fly breeding, because the life cycle of the fruit fly is so rapid, or they have to use this technique of genealogy, and genealogy is used to establish hereditary patterns of disease, some of which are real, others like hysteria are not real, or we wouldn't regard them as real. The issue of whether a disease is real or not becomes pretty tricky. And of course, part of this is one of the categories that becomes most closely associated with the eugenic movement at this time, which is the category of feeble-mindedness. Now, if you go and actually read Goddard's work, you'll see that there's a hierarchy of different conditions, with, I think, the moron at the bottom and the feeble-minded at the top. Feeble-mindedness was a condition that, in terms of talking to the individual or looking at them, there was very little about either the behaviour or the way they looked that could identify them as being feeble-minded. Feeble-minded being genetically produced. So they had to use these techniques of genealogy to trace what the other members of the family were like. A feeble-mindedness as a condition, if you construct it as a problem within the genotype, and you feel that it's threatening the population of your country, or it's threatening the race, this is the terms that they would have used to talk about it, it became very important to identify these individuals who couldn't be identified just by looking at them. And you begin to understand the fear that was produced of this vast category of the feeble-minded, who on the whole were not identifiable. Their feeble-mindedness might not have expressed itself. They might have been carrying it latent within their genotype, only to be expressed in the next generation. So it became critical for eugenicists to identify these individuals. Here we see a typical instance. Feeble-minded girl, not uncomely, but awfully dumb. For the eugenicists, it may be that her parents seemed completely normal, but they'd have looked at her and said, well, they were carrying these genes that produced feeble-mindedness. It didn't express in their generation, but next generation, it's come out and it's polluting the race. So using the genealogical techniques, there were attempts made to identify the genetic basis of crime, of alcoholism, of insanity. And it's going to promote solutions, some of which were positive, encouraging the right people to breed, some of which were negative, coercive measures to stop the wrong people from breeding. As we look at Davenport's eugenics as a religion, his eugenic creed, purged of God, we're not looking at a Darwinian document here. We're looking at a document that almost counterposes itself to Darwinian natural selection. We can see the kind of language that's being used here. Quasi-religious, the Nicene Creed for the eugenicist. I believe in striving to raise the human race to the highest plane of social organisation, of cooperative work and of effective endeavour. I believe that having made our choice in marriage carefully, we, the married pair, should seek to have 4 to 6 children in order that our carefully selected germplasm shall be reproduced in adequate degree, and that this preferred stock shall not be swamped by that less carefully selected. This is a creed for the genetically fit. I believe in repressing my instincts when to follow them would injure the next generation. So in other words, for those individuals that are perfectly okay but have got the underlying corruption within their germplasm, and you can maybe identify this because your parents were alcoholics or something, you've turned out all right, but you're not going to pass it on to the next generation. You're not going to breed. Now, Davenport meant this pretty damn seriously. This is not some kind of joke document. This is a blueprint to try and shape society eugenically. So to reiterate, positive eugenics was encouraging the well-born to breed. And here we see Davenport dressed for a function. The most progressive revolution in history could be achieved if somehow human matings could be placed upon the same high plane as that of horse breeding. I sometimes wonder how dumb you can get. You know, this guy is really, really smart. He's one of the smartest scientists in his area in the USA at this time. And it's a line I've heard people spin in my own lifetime. You know, we can breed thoroughbred horses. Well, what are thoroughbred horses like? You don't want to ride one unless you're pretty good at riding. You don't want their skittishness, their inherited craziness. Thoroughbred horses are dangerous. And of course, we know now that expanding the gene pool across wide ranges of the population is the way to go. Genetics people now tend to have a view of the necessity of keeping the gene pool broad. These guys wanted to narrow it until you just ended up with a bunch of cultured crazy people, I reckon, placed on the same high plane as that of horse breeding. So how was this to be done? It was to be done through these quasi-religious methods, through eugenic sermons, through exhibitions, through family competitions to identify the most eugenically fit children or babies, beautiful baby competitions, beauty pageants. Beauty pageants, in part, have a eugenic history. Here we see one of the health exhibits. Fitter families for Georgia. By the 1920s, there are 350 colleges and universities in the USA offering courses in eugenics. Marriage for happiness, that romantic ideal of love and marriage, was described as being born in selfishness and antisocial. Marriage should be to produce a eugenically fit generation. Contraception was a problem if the wrong people were using it, and the wrong people using it were the biologically fit. Remember, I promised to have 4 to 6 children. There are a whole group of people who should be using contraception that are not. It's one of the big problems that eugenicists identify. The wrong people breed too much, the feckless. Actually, you can see the lineage going back to Malthusian thought. And of course, there was a huge class dimension to this. The idea that middle and upper class women should stay at home, make babies, tend the family, and make the race. And in this model, feminism could be portrayed as it was emerging in the early 20th century as a form of race suicide. Women's suffrage could be regarded as upsetting human evolution. How about negative eugenics? This is the much nastier end of the equation, and it resulted in programs of one sort or another across the world. What did Charlie have to say about that? It's a reproach to our intelligence that we as people, proud in other respects of our control of nature, should have to support about 500,000 insane, feeble-minded, epileptic, blind and deaf, 80,000 prisoners, 100,000 paupers at a cost of over $100 million per day. If you can get rid of all of these people, breed it out, then society is going to become productive, wealthier, healthier. Now, I think what you might find shocking about this is that if you had said that that was a translation from Hitler or one of his henchmen, you would have believed it. And you'd have been quite right to believe it, because they said exactly these kind of things. One has to assume that people within the Third Reich were deeply influenced by the kind of operations that had gone on at Cold Spring Harbor. By the way, wonderful website. The place is still going, and it's got really fantastic material on there. So if you're interested in tracking a whole load of stuff down, they're very open about their history, and that's a good thing. They're not hiding any skeletons in a closet. Skeletons are all out in the open. There was tremendous pressure for action of a legislative sort, to try and curb this reservoir of corruption in the American germplasm. Incarceration and involuntary sterilisation became some of the methods that were deployed to implement eugenic measures. By the early 1920s, a number of states across the USA had compulsory sterilisation legislation on their books for individuals that were identified as being feeble-minded, to prevent them from breeding and passing on their germplasm. And as you can see here, many of these remain on the statute books until after World War II. And not only that, we should be careful not to be USA bashing here, because the USA wasn't alone in this. For example, all the countries in Scandinavia had the same kind of legislation. In somewhere, I think it was Sweden, it wasn't actually repealed until the 1970s. Doesn't mean it was used up until that point, but it took for that long for the legislation to be repealed. Countries all across the world are using these particular techniques. And I guess it finds its clearest and most famous expression in the case of Carrie Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck, who had been incarcerated in the Virginia State Colony for epileptics and the feeble-minded, was the centre of a controversy over this, in that it was ordered that she be forcibly sterilised after her family had had her committed and said that she was feeble-minded. And a case was fought to try and prevent her sterilisation. In retrospect, when people have done research on this, they found that there was nothing wrong with her. She was caught up in a a family dispute, the kind of thing that occurs when there are step-parents around, and her incarceration appears to have been the result of internal family politics rather than any mental condition that she was suffering from. So there was a court case between two parties, and her forcible sterilisation was upheld. She was declared, like her mother, to be feeble-minded and promiscuous, and to have a mental age of 8. None of these things appear to have been true. And as it went to appeal and was upheld at appeal, the famous Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., sitting on the Supreme Court, made his most famous quote, "3 generations of imbeciles is enough." There was incredible propaganda put about to try and enforce various forms of negative eugenics. The film The Black Stork toured the flea pits of the USA during the 30s and 1940s, putting forward a true life case of a woman whose child has been born deformed and the decision of the doctor to euthanize that, put in such a way that it puts the decision to kill the child after birth as being a good decision on eugenic grounds. It does that classic thing of showing what would have happened if the child had lived, and basically what would have happened was the collapse of civilization. So we have her, he's going to let her baby die. This woman says, it's for the best. The woman being the woman who's given birth. So this is very serious stuff. It's not something going on up there in the realm of the ether. Now, of course, as I've already hinted at, we tend to think of eugenics as being this kind of right-wing movement. And this is completely and utterly fallacious. There was political support across the board for eugenics, such that in the UK, a lot of the pressure to implement eugenic programs came from the Fabian left rather than from the conservative right. Now, it has to be said, in Britain, the kind of things that were going on in the USA didn't occur. There was no legislation brought in to allow forcible sterilisation. But there was still a lot of pressure from the left. I think the reason we associate eugenics with the right is because of Nazi Germany. But it's as well to remember that people on the left were as willing to promote the eugenic programme as people on the right. We can see this in the work of Diane Paul, The Politics of Heredity, where she explores in considerable detail the influence of the left upon the development of eugenics. There are several classic examples of this. We know, for example, George Bernard Shaw, the Fabian and playwright, was a rampant eugenicist. Mary Stopes is now upheld as some kind of secular saint in the USA because it was through Mary Stopes that these contraception birth control clinics sprang up to help women with birth control. And in retrospect, she's perceived as this kind of wonderful figure doing wonderful things for women. But her whole motivation in writing her book Married Love and setting up the clinics were eugenic. She wanted the contraception to be applied for the women that should be not having families as much as anything else. And then there was the example of JBS Haldane. He's a eugenicist as well as being a Marxist. And it might be very hard to think about squaring that particular circle. Haldane's eugenicism was quite sophisticated. He believed until society was equal, it would be impossible to identify the impact of genetics upon the population, because you couldn't filter out the social from the biological until you had an equal society. So Haldane's position was we had to have revolution followed by utopia, socialist equality, and then we'd be able to see biological difference emerge rather than social difference. So there were a number of different ways of spinning the equation. And time and again you'll find, usually every year, there's someone talking about the left's relationship with eugenics and people saying, oh, bloody hell, didn't know that. And here's Geoffrey Robertson, who wrote in an article in The Guardian in 2008, we should say sorry, pointing out the left's involvement within the eugenics programme. White Australians may castigate themselves today for their deluded assimilation efforts, but it's necessary, as with every genocide, to sheet home responsibility. And the people he's sheeting home responsibility to are individuals like Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Bertrand Russell, major figure of 20th century philosophy. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, some of the founders of social history and very important in the early Labour Party. Virginia Woolf, who I'm sure you all know about, and D.H. Lawrence, all of them promoting some degree of eugenics program. Eugenics and social Darwinism. The most important thing to point out here is that two things are obviously not reducible to each other. There are clearly overlaps. Obviously, the eugenics program found its initial inspiration from Darwin and Darwin's theories. Obviously, though, by the early 20th century, the early genetics movement was leading the way in promoting eugenics program, and that movement was fundamentally opposed to Darwinism. But then by the 1920s, when the two models are coming closer together, it takes on even more force and feeds into Nazi Germany. It's also the point that social Darwinism, as we've already seen as a program, emphasises non-intervention. Now, one of the problems that eugenicists identify is the way society has developed has prevented, human civilization prevents natural selection, which is why we have to intervene. But we also see that robber baron form of social Darwinism, where non-intervention in the market, in capitalism, or in life itself was the order of the day. So eugenics is intervention and anti-laissez-faire. Natural selection, not Mendelianism. Eugenics equals natural selection or Mendelianism. Not all social Darwinians are eugenicists. And before the new synthesis, some eugenicists are social Darwinians. But after the new synthesis, all eugenicists are definitely social Darwinians.